Chapter 37 honorably accounts for Mr. Weller's absence by describing a soirée to which he was invited and went. Also relates how he was entrusted by Mr. Pickwick with a private mission of delicacy and importance. "Mr. Weller," said Mrs. Craddock upon the morning of this very eventful day, "he has a letter for you."
"Really all that?" said Sam. "I'm afeard there must be something the matter, for I don't recollect any gentleman in my circle of acquaintance as is capable of writing one."
"Perhaps something uncommon has taken place," observed Mrs. Craddock.
"It must be something really uncommon indeed, as could produce a letter out of any friend of mine," replied Sam, shaking his head dubiously. "Nothing less than a natural convulsion, as the young gentleman observed when he was took with fitch." "It can't be from the governor," said Sam, looking at the direction. "He always prints, I know, because he learnt writing from the large bills in the booking offices. It's a really strange thing, now, where this letter can have come from."
As Sam said this, he did what a great many people do when they are uncertain about the writer of a note. Looked at the seal, and then at the front, and then at the back, and then at the sides, and then at the superscription, and, as a last resource, thought perhaps he might as well look at the inside and try to find out from that.
"It's wrote on gilt-edged paper," said Sam, as he unfolded it, "and sealed in bronze wax with the top of a door key. Now for it."
And with a very grave face, Mr. Weller slowly read as follows. "A select company of the Bath footmen presents their compliments to Mr. Weller, and requests the pleasure of his company this evening to a friendly soirée, consisting of a boiled leg of mutton, with the usual trimmings, the soirée to be on table at 9:30 punctually." This was enclosed in another note, which ran thus: "Mr. John Smocker, the gentleman who had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Weller at the house of their mutual acquaintance, Mr. Bantam, a few days since, begs to enclose Mr. Weller the herewith invitation. If Mr. Weller will call on Mr. John Smocker at 9 o'clock, Mr. John Smocker will have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Weller. Signed, John Smocker." The envelope was directed to Blank Weller, Esquire, at Mr. Pickwick's, and in a parenthesis in the left corner were the words "Airy Bell," as an instruction to the bearer.
"Well," said Sam, "this is coming it rather powerful, this is. I never heard a boiled leg of mutton called a soirée afore. I wonder what they'd call a roast one."
However, without waiting to debate the point, Sam at once betook himself into the presence of Mr. Pickwick, and requested leave of absence for that evening, which was readily granted. With this permission, and the street door key, Sam Weller issued forth a little before the appointed time, and strolled leisurely towards Queen Square, which he no sooner gained than he had the satisfaction of beholding Mr. John Smocker leaning his powdered head against a lamp-post at a short distance off, smoking a cigar through an amber tube.
"How do you do, Mr. Weller?" said Mr. John Smocker, raising his hat gracefully with one hand, while he gently waved the other in a condescending manner. "How do you do, sir?" "Why, reasonably convalescent," replied Sam. "How do you find yourself, my dear fellow?"
"Only so-so," said Mr. John Smocker.
"Ah, you've been working too hard," observed Sam. "I was fearful you would. It won't do, you know. You must not give way to that 'ere uncompromising spirit of yourn."
"It's not so much that, Mr. Weller," replied Mr. John Smocker,
"as bad wine.
I'm afraid I've been dissipating."
"Oh, that's it, is it?" said Sam. "That's a really bad complaint, that."
"And yet the temptation, you see, Mr. Weller," observed Mr. John Smocker.
"Ah, to be sure," said Sam.
"Plunged into the very vortex of society, you know, Mr. Weller," said Mr. John Smocker, with a sigh.
"Dreadful indeed," rejoined Sam.
"But it's always the way," said Mr. John Smocker. "If your destiny leads you into public life and public station, you must expect to be subjected to temptations which other people is free from, Mr. Weller."
"Precisely what my uncle said when he went into the public line," remarked Sam. "And very right the old gentleman was, for he drank himself to death in something less than a quarter."
Mr. John Smocker looked deeply indignant at a parallel being drawn between himself and the deceased gentleman in question. But as Sam's face was in the most immovable state of calmness, he thought the better of it, and looked affable again. "Perhaps we had better be walking," said Mr. Smocker, consulting a copper timepiece which dwelt at the bottom of a deep watch-pocket, and was raised to the surface by means of a black string, with a copper key at the other end.
"Perhaps we had," replied Sam, "or they'll overdo the soirée, and they'll spoil it."
"Have you drank the waters, Mr. Weller?" inquired his companion, as they walked towards the High Street.
"Once," replied Sam. What do you think of 'em, sir?" "I thought they was particularly unpleasant," replied Sam. "Ah," said Mr. John Smocker, "you disliked the killibeate taste, perhaps." "I don't know much about that here," said Sam. "I thought they'd a very strong flavour of warm flat irons." "That is the killibeate, Mr. Weller," observed John Smocker contemptuously. "Well, if it is, it's a very inexpressive word, that's all," said Sam. "It may be, but I ain't much in the chemical line myself, so I can't say." And here, to the great horror of Mr. John Smocker, Sam Weller began to whistle. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Weller," said Mr. John Smocker, agonized at the exceedingly ungenteel sound. "Will you take my arm?" "Thank ye, you're very good, but I won't deprive you of it," replied Sam. "I've rather a way of putting my hands in my pockets, if it's all the same to you." As Sam said this, he suited the action to the word, and whistled far louder than before. "This way," said his new friend, apparently much relieved as they turned down a by-street. "We shall soon be there." "Shall we?" said Sam, quite unmoved by the announcement of his close vicinity to the select footman of Bath. "Yes," said Mr. John Smocker. "Don't be alarmed, Mr. Weller." "Oh, no," said Sam. "You'll see some very handsome uniforms, Mr. Weller," continued Mr. John Smocker, "and perhaps you'll find some of the gentlemen rather high at first, you know, but they'll soon come round." "That's really kind on 'em," replied Sam. "And you know," resumed Mr. John Smocker, with an air of sublime protection, "you know, as you're a stranger, perhaps they'll be rather hard upon you at first." "They won't be very cruel, though, will they?" inquired Sam. "No, no," replied Mr. John Smocker, pulling forth the fox's head and taking a gentlemanly pinch. "There are some funny dogs among us, and they will have their jokes, you know. But you mustn't mind 'em, you mustn't mind 'em." "I'll try and bear up against such a regular knock-down of talent," replied Sam. "That's right," said Mr. John Smocker, putting up the fox's head and elevating his own. "I'll stand by you." By this time they had reached a small greengrocer's shop, which Mr. John Smocker entered, followed by Sam, who, the moment he got behind him, relapsed into a series of the very broadest and most unmitigated grins, and manifested other demonstrations of being in a highly enviable state of inward merriment. Crossing the greengrocer's shop, and putting their hats on the stairs in a little passage behind it, they walked into a small parlor, and here the full splendor of the scene burst upon Mr. Weller's view. A couple of tables were put together in the middle of the parlor, covered with 3 or 4 cloths of different ages and dates of washing, arranged to look as much like one as the circumstances of the case would allow. Upon these were laid knives and forks for 6 or 8 people. Some of the knife handles were green, others red, and a few more yellow, and as all the forks were black, the combination of colors was exceedingly striking. Plates for a corresponding number of guests were warming behind the fender, and the guests themselves were warming before it, the chief and most important of whom appeared to be a stoutish gentleman in a bright crimson coat with long tags, vividly red breeches, and a cocked hat, who was standing with his back to the fire, and had apparently just entered, for besides retaining his cocked hat on his head, he carried in his hand a high stick, such as gentlemen of his profession usually elevate in a sloping position over the roofs of carriages. "Smocker, my lad, you're in," said the gentleman with the cocked hat. Mr. Smocker dovetailed the top joint of his right-hand little finger into that of the gentleman with the cocked hat, and said he was charmed to see him looking so well. "Well, they tell me I am looking pretty blooming," said the man with the cocked hat, "and it's a wonder, too. I've been following our old woman about 2 hours a day for the last fortnight, and if a constant contemplation of the manner in which she hooks and eyes that infernal lavender-coloured gown of hers behind isn't enough to throw anybody into a low state of despondency for life, stop my quarter's salary." At this, the assembled selections laughed very heartily, and one gentleman in a yellow waistcoat, with a coach-trimming border, whispered a neighbour in full green-foil smalls that Tuckle was in spirits tonight. "By the by," said Mr. Tuckle, "Smocker, my boy, you, The remainder of the sentence was forwarded into Mr. John Smocker's ear by whisper. "Oh, dear me, I quite forgot," said Mr. John Smocker. "Gentlemen, my friend Mr. Weller." "Sorry to keep the fire off you, Weller," said Mr. Tuckle, with a familiar nod. "Hope you're not cold, Weller." "Not by no means, Blazes," replied Sam. "It'd be a very chilly subject, as felt cold when you stood opposite. You'd save coals if they put you behind the fender in the waiting room at the public office, you would." As this retort appeared to convey rather a personal allusion to Mr. Tuckle's crimson livery, that gentleman looked majestic for a few seconds,
but gradually edging away from the fire, broke into a forced smile, and said it wasn't bad. "Very much obliged for your good opinion, sir," replied Sam. "We shall get on by degrees, I dare say. We'll try a better one by and by." At this point, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a gentleman in orange-colored plush, accompanied by another selection in purple cloth, with a great extent of stocking. The newcomers having been welcomed by the old ones, Mr. Tuckle put the question that supper be ordered in, which was carried unanimously. The greengrocer and his wife then arranged upon the table a boiled leg of mutton, hot, with caper sauce, turnips, and potatoes. Mr. Tuckle took the chair, and was supported at the other end of the board by the gentleman in orange plush. The greengrocer put on a pair of watch-leather gloves to hand the plates with, and stationed himself behind Mr. Tuckle's chair. "Harris," said Mr. Tuckle in a commanding tone. "Sir?" said the greengrocer. "Have you got your gloves on?" "Yes, sir." "Then take the cover off." "Yes, sir." The greengrocer did as he was told, with a show of great humility, and obsequiously handed Mr. Tuckle the carving knife, in doing which he accidentally yawned. "What do you mean by that, sir?" said Mr. Tuckle, with great asperity. "I beg your pardon, sir," replied the crestfallen greengrocer. "I didn't mean to do it, sir. I was up very late last night, sir." "I tell you what my opinion of you is, Harris," said Mr. Tuckle, with a most impressive air. "You're a vulgar beast." "I hope, gentlemen," said Harris, "that you won't be severe with me, gentlemen. I'm very much obliged to you indeed, gentlemen, for your patronage, and also for your recommendations, gentlemen. Whenever additional assistance in waiting is required, I hope, gentlemen, I give satisfaction." "No, you don't, sir," said Mr. Tuckle. "Very far from it, sir." "We consider you an inattentive rascal," said the gentleman in the orange plush. "And a low thief," added the gentleman in the green foil smalls. "And an unreclaimable blackguard," added the gentleman in purple. The poor greengrocer bowed very humbly, while these little epithets were bestowed upon him, in the true spirit of the very smallest tyranny. And when everybody had said something to show his superiority, Mr. Tuckle proceeded to carve the leg of mutton, and to help the company. This important business of the evening was hardly commenced, when the door was thrown briskly open, and another gentleman in a light blue suit and leaden buttons made his appearance. "Against the rules," said Mr. Tuckle. "Too late, too late." No, positively I couldn't help it," said the gentleman in blue. "I appeal to the company. An affair of gallantry now. An appointment at the theatre." "Oh, that indeed," said the gentleman in the orange plush. "Yes, really now, honour bright," said the man in blue. "I made a promise to fetch our youngest daughter at 10:30, and she is such an uncommonly fine gal that I rarely hadn't the art to disappoint her. No offence to the present company, sir, but a petticoat, sir, is irrevocable." "I begin to suspect there's something in that quarter," said Tuckle, as the newcomer took his seat next Sam. "I've remarked once or twice that she leans very heavy on your shoulder when she gets in and out of the carriage." "Oh, really, Tuckle, you shouldn't," said the man in blue. "It's not fair. I may have said to one or two friends that she was a very divine creature, and had refused one or two offers without any obvious cause. But no, indeed, Tuckle. Before strangers, too, it's not right. You shouldn't. Delicacy, my dear friend, delicacy." And the man in blue, pulling up his neckerchief and adjusting his coat cuffs, nodded and frowned as if there were more behind which he could say if he liked, but was bound in honor to suppress. The man in blue, being a light-haired, stiff-necked, free and easy sort of footman, with a swaggering air and pert face, had attracted Mr. Weller's especial attention at first, but when he began to come out in this way, Sam felt more than ever disposed to cultivate his acquaintance. So he launched himself into the conversation at once, with characteristic independence. "Your health, sir," said Sam. "I like your conversation much. I think it's very pretty." At this, the man in blue smiled, as if it were a compliment he was well used to, but looked approvingly on Sam at the same time, and said he hoped he should be better acquainted with him, for without any flattery at all, he seemed to have the makings of a very nice fellow about him, just the man after his own heart. "You're really good, sir," said Sam. "What a lucky fellow you are." "How do you mean?" inquired the gentleman in blue. "That 'ere young lady," replied Sam. "She knows what's what, she does." "Ah, I see." Mr. Weller closed one eye, and shook his head from side to side in a manner which was highly gratifying to the personal vanity of the gentleman in blue. "I'm afraid you're a cunning fellow, Mr. Weller," said that individual. No, said Sam. "I'll leave that all here to you. It's a great deal more in your way than mine. As the gentleman on the right side of the garden wall said to the man on the wrong un,
when the mad bull was a-coming up the line.
Well, Mr. Weller, said the gentleman in blue, I think she has remarked my air and manner, Mr. Weller.
I should think she couldn't very well be off of that, said Sam.
Have you any little thing of that kind in hand, sir? Inquired the favoured gentleman in blue, drawing a toothpick from his waistcoat pocket.
Not exactly, said Sam. There's no daughters at my place, else of course I should have made up to run on 'em. As it is, I don't think I can do with anything under a female marquis. I might take up with a young woman, a large property as hatting a title, if she made very fierce love to me. Not else.
Of course not, Mr. Weller, said the gentleman in blue. One can't be troubled, you know, and we know, Mr. Weller, we who are men of the world, that a good uniform must work its way with the women sooner or later. In fact, that's the only thing between you and I that makes the service worth entering into.
Just so, said Sam. That's it, of course.
When this confidential dialogue had gone thus far, glasses were placed round, and every gentleman ordered what he liked best before the public house shut up. The gentleman in blue and the man in orange, who were the chief exquisites of the party, ordered cold srub and water, but with the others, gin and water sweet appeared to be the favorite beverage. Sam called the greengrocer a desperate villain, and ordered a large bowl of punch, two circumstances which seemed to raise him very much in the opinion of the selections. "Gentlemen," said the man in blue, with an air of the most consummate dandyism, "I'll give you the ladies. Come."
"Here, here," said Sam. "The young mistresses."
Here there was a loud cry of "Order!" and Mr. John Smocker, as the gentleman who had introduced Mr. Weller into that company, begged to inform him that the word he had just made use of was unparliamentary.
"Which word was that here, sir?"
inquired Sam. "Mississes, sir," replied Mr. John Smocker, with an alarming frown. "We don't recognize such distinctions here."
"Oh, very good," said Sam. "Then now amend the observation, and call them the dear creatures, if Blazes will allow me."
Some doubt appeared to exist in the mind of the gentleman in the green foil smalls, whether the chairman could be legally appealed to as Blazes, but as the company seemed more disposed to stand upon their own rights than his, the question was not raised. The man with the cocked hat breathed short and looked long at Sam, but apparently thought it was as well to say nothing in case he should get the worst of it. After a short silence, a gentleman in an embroidered coat reaching down to his heels, and a waistcoat of the same which kept one half of his legs warm, stirred his gin and water with great energy, and putting himself upon his feet, all at once, by a violent effort, said he was desirous of offering a few remarks to the company, whereupon the person in the cocked hat had no doubt that the company would be very happy to hear any remarks that the man in the long coat might wish to offer. "I feel a great delicacy, gentlemen, in coming forward," said the man in the long coat, "having the misfortune to be a coachman, and being only admitted as an honorary member of these agreeable soirees. But I do feel myself bound, gentlemen, drove into a corner, if I may use the expression, to make known an afflicting circumstance which has come to my knowledge, which has happened, I may say, within the scope of my everyday contemplation. Gentlemen, our friend Mr. Whiffers," everybody looked at the individual in orange, "our friend Mr. Whiffers has resigned." Universal astonishment fell upon the hearers. Each gentleman looked in his neighbor's face, and then transferred his glance to the upstanding coachman. "You may well be surprised, gentlemen," said the coachman. "I will not venture to state the reasons of this irreparable loss to the service, but I will beg Mr. Whiffers to state them himself, for the improvement and imitation of his admiring friends." The suggestion being loudly approved of, Mr. Whiffers explained. He said he certainly could have wished to have continued to hold the appointment which he had just resigned. The uniform was extremely rich and expensive, the females of the family was most agreeable, and the duties of the situation was not, he was bound to say, too heavy. The principal service that was required of him being that he should look out of the hall window as much as possible, in company with another gentleman who had also resigned. He could have wished to have spared that company the painful and disgusting detail on which he was about to enter, but as the explanation had been demanded of him, he had no alternative but to state boldly and distinctly that he had been required to eat cold meat. It is impossible to conceive the disgust which this avowal awakened in the bosoms of the hearers. Loud cries of "Shame!" mingled with groans and hisses, prevailed for a quarter of an hour at least. Mr. Whiffers then added that he feared a portion of this outrage might be traced to his own forbearing and accommodating disposition. He had a distinct recollection of having once consented to eat salt butter, and he had, moreover, on an occasion of sudden sickness in the house, so far forgotten himself as to carry a coal scuttle up to the second floor. He trusted he had not lowered himself in the good opinion of his friends by this frank confession of his faults, and he hoped the promptness with which he had resented the last unmanly outrage on his feelings, to which he had referred, would reinstate him in their good opinion if he had. Mr. Whiffer's address was responded to with a shout of admiration, and the health of the interesting martyr was drunk in a most enthusiastic manner. For this, the martyr returned thanks, and proposed their visitor, Mr. Weller, a gentleman whom he had not the pleasure of an intimate acquaintance with, but who was the friend of Mr. John Smocker, which was a sufficient letter of recommendation to any society of gentlemen whatever, or wherever. On this account, he should have been disposed to have given Mr. Weller's health with all the honours, if his friends had been drinking wine, but as they were taking spirits just by way of a change, and as it might be inconvenient to empty a tumbler at every toast, he should propose that the honours be understood. At the conclusion of this speech, everybody took a sip out of their tumblers in honour of Sam, and Sam, having ladled out and drank 2 full glasses of punch in honour of himself, returned thanks in a neat speech. "Very much obliged to you, old fellers," said Sam, ladling away at the punch in the most unembarrassed manner possible, "for this here compliment, which, coming from sich a quarter, is really overwhelming. I've heard a good deal on you as a body, but I will say that I never thought you was such uncommon nice men as I find you air. I only hope you'll take care of yourselves, and not compromise nothing on your dignity, which is a very charming thing to see when one's out a-walking, and has always made me very happy to look at, ever since I was a boy about half as high as the brass-headed stick of my really respectable friend Blazes there. As to the victim of oppression in the suit of brimstone, all I can say of him is that I hope he'll get just as good a berth as he deserves, in which case it's really little cold sweaty as ever he'll be troubled with again." Here Sam sat down with a pleasant smile, and his speech having been vociferously applauded, the company broke up. "Why, you don't mean to say you're a-going, old fella?" said Sam Weller to his friend Mr. John Smocker. "I must indeed," said Mr. John Smocker. "I promised Bantam." "Oh, very well," said Sam. "That's another thing. Perhaps he'd resign if you disappointed him. You ain't a-going, Blazes?" "Yes, I am," said the man with the cocked hat. "What, and leave 3/4 of a bottle of punch behind you?" said Sam. "Nonsense, sit down again." Mr. Tuckle was not proof against this invitation. He laid aside the cocked hat and stick which he had just taken up, and said he would have 1 glass just for good fellowship's sake. As the gentleman in blue went home the same way as Mr. Tuckle, he was prevailed upon to stop too. When the punch was about half gone, Sam ordered in some oysters from the greengrocer's shop, and the effect of both was so extremely exhilarating that Mr. Tuckle, dressed out with the cocked hat and stick, danced the frog hornpipe among the shells on the table, while the gentleman in blue played an accompaniment upon an ingenious musical instrument formed of a hair comb and a curl paper. At last, when the punch was all gone, and the night nearly so, they sallied forth to see each other home. Mr. Tuckle no sooner got into the open air than he was seized with a sudden desire to lie on the curbstone. Sam thought it would be a pity to contradict him, and so let him have his own way. As the cocked hat would have been spoilt if left there, Sam very considerately flattened it down on the head of the gentleman in blue, and putting the big stick in his hand, propped him up against his own street door, rang the bell, and walked quietly home. At a much earlier hour next morning than his usual time of rising, Mr. Pickwick walked downstairs completely dressed, and rang the bell. "Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, when Mr. Weller appeared in reply to the summons, "shut the door." Mr. Weller did so. "There was an unfortunate occurrence here last night, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, "which gave Mr. Winkle some cause to apprehend violence from Mr. Dowler." "So I've heard from the old lady downstairs, sir," replied Sam. "And I'm sorry to say, Sam," continued Mr. Pickwick, with a most perplexed countenance, "that in the dread of this violence, Mr. Winkle has gone away." "Gone away?" said Sam. "Left the house early this morning without the slightest previous communication with me," replied Mr. Pickwick, "and is gone I know not where." "You should have stopped and fought it out, sir," replied Sam contemptuously. "It wouldn't take much to sell that here Dowler, sir." "Well, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, "I may have my doubts of his great bravery and determination also. But however that may be, Mr. Winkle is gone. He must be found, Sam. Found and brought back to me."
"I suppose he won't come back, sir," said Sam.
"He must be made, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick.
"Who's to do it, sir?" inquired Sam with a smile.
"You," replied Mr. Pickwick.
"Really good, sir."
With these words, Mr. Weller left the room, and immediately afterwards was heard to shut the street door. In 2 hours' time, he returned with as much coolness as if he had been dispatched on the most ordinary message possible, and brought the information that an individual in every respect answering Mr. Winkle's description had gone over to Bristol that morning by the branch coach from the Royal Hotel. "Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, grasping his hand, "you're a capital fellow, an invaluable fellow. You must follow him, Sam."
"Certainly, sir,"
replied Mr. Weller. "The instant you discover him, write to me immediately, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick. "If he attempts to run away from you, knock him down or lock him up. You have my full authority, Sam."
"I'll be really careful, sir,"
rejoined Sam. "You'll tell him," said Mr. Pickwick, "that I am highly excited, highly displeased, and naturally indignant at the very extraordinary course he has thought proper to pursue."
"I will, sir," replied Sam.
"You'll tell him," said Mr. Pickwick, "that if he does not come back to this very house with you, he will come back with me, for I will come and fetch him."
"I'll mention that here, sir,"
rejoined Sam. "You think you can find him, Sam?" said Mr. Pickwick, looking earnestly in his face.
"Oh, I'll find him if he's anywhere," rejoined Sam with great confidence.
"Very well," said Mr. Pickwick. "Then the sooner you go, the better." With these instructions, Mr. Pickwick placed a sum of money in the hands of his faithful servitor, and ordered him to start for Bristol immediately in pursuit of the fugitive. Sam put a few necessaries in a carpet-bag, and was ready for starting. He stopped when he had got to the end of the passage, and walking quietly back, thrust his head in at the parlor door.
"Sir,"
whispered Sam. "Well, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick.
"I fully understand my instructions, do I, sir?"
inquired Sam. "I hope so," said Mr. Pickwick.
"It's regularly understood about the knocking down, is it, sir?" inquired Sam.
"Perfectly," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Thoroughly. Do what you think necessary. You have my orders." Sam gave a nod of intelligence, and withdrawing his head from the door, set forth on his pilgrimage with a light heart. Chapter 38. How Mr. Winkle, when he stepped out of the frying pan, walked gently and comfortably into the fire. The ill-starred gentleman who had been the unfortunate cause of the unusual noise and disturbance which alarmed the inhabitants of the Royal Crescent in manner and form already described, after passing a night of great confusion and anxiety, left the roof beneath which his friends still slumbered, bound he knew not whither. The excellent and considerate feelings which prompted Mr. Winkle to take this step can never be too highly appreciated or too warmly extolled. "If," reasoned Mr. Winkle with himself, "if this Dowler attempts, as I have no doubt he will, to carry into execution his threat of personal violence against myself, it will be incumbent on me to call him out. He has a wife. That wife is attached to and dependent on him. Heavens, if I should kill him in the blindness of my wrath, what would be my feelings ever afterwards?" This painful consideration operated so powerfully on the feelings of the humane young man as to cause his knees to knock together and his countenance to exhibit alarming manifestations of inward emotion. Impelled by these reflections, he grasped his carpet-bag, and creeping stealthily downstairs, shut the detestable street door with as little noise as possible, and walked off. Bending his steps towards the Royal Hotel, he found a coach on the point of starting for Bristol, and thinking Bristol as good a place for his purpose as any other he could go to, mounted on the box, and reached his place of destination in such time as the pair of horses, who went the whole stage and back again twice a day or more, could be reasonably supposed to arrive there. He took up his quarters at the Bush, and designing to postpone any communication by letter with Mr. Pickwick until it was probable that Mr. Dowler's wrath might have in some degree evaporated, walked forth to view the city, which struck him as being a shade more dirty than any place he had ever seen. Having inspected the docks and shipping, and viewed the cathedral, he inquired his way to Clifton, and being directed thither, took the route which was pointed out to him. But, as the pavements of Bristol are not the widest or cleanest upon earth, so its streets are not altogether the straightest or least intricate, and Mr. Winkle, being greatly puzzled by their manifold windings and twistings, looked about him for a decent shop in which he could apply fresh for counsel and instruction. His eye fell upon a newly painted tenement, which had been recently converted into something between a shop and a private house, in which a red lamp, projecting over the fanlight of the street door, would have sufficiently announced as the residence of a medical practitioner, even if the word surgery had not been inscribed in golden characters on a wainscot ground above the window of what, in times bygone, had been the front parlor. Thinking this an eligible place wherein to make his inquiries, Mr. Winkle stepped into the little shop where the gilt-labeled drawers and bottles were, and finding nobody there, knocked with a half-crown on the counter to attract the attention of anybody who might happen to be in the back parlor, which he judged to be the innermost and peculiar sanctum of the establishment, from the repetition of the word surgery on the door, painted in white letters this time, by way of taking off the sameness. At the first knock, a sound as of persons fencing with fire irons, which had until now been very audible, suddenly ceased, and at the second, a studious-looking young gentleman in green spectacles, with a very large book in his hand, glided quietly into the shop, and stepping behind the counter, requested to know the visitor's pleasure. "I am sorry to trouble you, sir," said Mr. Winkle, "but will you have the goodness to direct me to—" "Ha ha 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 ha!" roared the studious young gentleman, throwing the large book up into the air, and catching it with great dexterity at the very moment when it threatened to smash to atoms all the bottles on the counter. "Here's a start!" There was, without doubt, for Mr. Winkle was so very much astonished at the extraordinary behavior of the medical gentleman that he involuntarily retreated towards the door, and looked very much disturbed at his strange reception. "What, you don't know me?" said the medical gentleman. Mr. Winkle murmured in reply that he had not that pleasure. "Why, then," said the medical gentleman, "there are hopes for me yet. I may attend half the old women in Bristol if I've decent luck. Get out, you mouldy old villain, get out!" With this adjuration, which was addressed to the large book, the medical gentleman kicked the volume with remarkable agility to the further end of the shop, grinned the identical grin of Robert Sawyer, Esquire, formerly of Guy's Hospital in the Borough, with a private residence in Lance Street. "You don't mean to say you won't down upon me?" said Mr. Bob Sawyer, shaking Mr. Winkle's hand with friendly warmth. "Upon my word, I was not," replied Mr. Winkle, returning the pressure. "I wonder you didn't see the name," said Bob Sawyer, calling his friend's attention to the outer door, on which, in the same white paint, were traced the words, "Sawyer, late necromorph." "It never caught my eye," returned Mr. Winkle. "Lord, if I had known who you were, I should have rushed out and caught you in my arms," said Bob Sawyer. "But upon my life, I thought you were the king's taxes." "No," said Mr. Winkle. "I did indeed," responded Bob Sawyer, "and I was just going to say that I wasn't at home, but if you'd leave a message, I'd be sure to give it to myself, for he don't know me, no more does the lighting and paving. I think the church rates guesses who I am, and I know the waterworks does, because I drew a tooth of his when I first came down here. But come in, come in." Chattering in this way, Mr. Bob Sawyer pushed Mr. Winkle into the back room, where, amusing himself by boring little circular caverns in the chimney-piece with a red-hot poker, sat no less a person than Mr. Benjamin Allen. "Well," said Mr. Winkle, "this is indeed a pleasure I did not expect. What a very nice place you have here." Pretty well," replied Bob Sawyer. "I passed soon after that precious party, and my friends came down with the needful for this business. So I put on a black suit of clothes and a pair of spectacles, and came here to look as solemn as I could." "And a very snug little business you have, no doubt," said Mr. Winkle knowingly. "Very," replied Bob Sawyer. "So snug that at the end of a few years you might put all the profits in a wine-glass and cover 'em over with a gooseberry leaf." "You cannot surely mean that," said Mr. Winkle. "The stock itself—" "Dummies, my dear boy," said Mr. Bob Sawyer. "Half the drawers have got nothing in them, and the other half don't open." "Nonsense," said Mr. Winkle. "Fact! Honor!" returned Mr. Bob Sawyer, stepping out into the shop, and demonstrating the veracity of the assertion by divers hard pulls at the little gilt knobs on the counterfeit drawers. "Hardly anything real in the shop but the leeches, and they are second-hand." "I shouldn't have thought it," exclaimed Mr. Winkle, much surprised. "I hope not," replied Bob Sawyer. "Else where's the use of appearances, eh? But what will you take? Do as we do? That's right. Ben, my fine fellow, put your hand into the cupboard and bring out the patent digester." Mr. Benjamin Allen smiled his readiness, and produced from the closet at his elbow a black bottle half full of brandy. "You don't take water, of course," said Bob Sawyer. "Thank you," replied Mr. Winkle. "It's rather early. I should like to qualify it if you have no objection." "None in the least, if you can reconcile it to your conscience," replied Bob Sawyer, tossing off as he spoke a glass of the liquor with a great relish. "Bid the pipkin." Mr. Benjamin Allen drew forth from the same hiding place a small brass pipkin, which Bob Sawyer observed he prided himself upon particularly, because it looked so businesslike. The water in the professional pipkin having been made to boil in course of time by various little shovelfuls of coal, which Mr. Bob Sawyer took out of a practicable window seat, labeled soda water. Mr. Winkle adulterated his brandy, and the conversation was becoming general, when it was interrupted by the entrance into the shop of a boy in a sober gray livery and a gold-laced hat, with a small covered basket under his arm, whom Mr. Bob Sawyer immediately hailed with, "Tom, you vagabond, come here!" The boy presented himself accordingly. "You've been stopping to over all the posts in Bristol, you idle young scamp," said Mr. Bob Sawyer. "No, sir, I haven't," replied the boy. "You had better not," said Mr. Bob Sawyer with a threatening aspect. "Who do you suppose will ever employ a professional man when they see his boy playing at marbles in the gutter, or flying the garter in the horse road? Have you no feeling for your profession, you groveller? Did you leave all the medicine?" "Yes, sir." "The powders for the child, at the large house, with the new family, and the pills to be taken 4 times a day at the ill-tempered old gentleman's, with the gouty leg?" "Yes, sir." "Then shut the door and mind the shop." "Come," said Mr. Winkle, as the boy retired. "Things are not quite so bad as you would have me believe, either. There is some medicine to be sent out." Mr. Bob Sawyer peeped into the shop to see that no stranger was within hearing, and leaning forward to Mr. Winkle, said in a low tone, "He leaves it all at the wrong houses." Mr. Winkle looked perplexed, and Bob Sawyer, his friend, laughed. "Don't you see?" said Bob. "He goes up to a house, rings the area bell, pokes a packet of medicine without a direction into the servant's hands, and walks off. Servant takes it into the dining parlour, master opens it, and reads the label. Draught to be taken at bedtime, pills as before, lotion as usual, the powder. From Sawyer's, late necamorphs, physician's prescriptions carefully prepared, and all the rest of it. Shows it to his wife. She reads the label. It goes down to the servants. They read the label. Next day the boy calls. Very sorry, his mistake. Immense business. Great many parcels to deliver. Mr. Sawyer's compliments. Late necamorph. The name gets known. And that's the thing, my boy, in the medical way. Bless your heart, you old fellow. It's better than all the advertising in the world. We've got 1 4-ounce bottle that's been to half the houses in Bristol, and hasn't done yet. Dear me, I see, observed Mr. Winkle. What an excellent plan. Oh, Ben and I have hit upon a dozen such, replied Bob Sawyer with great glee. The lamplighter has 18 pence a week to pull the night bell for 10 minutes, every time he comes round, and my boy always rushes into church just before the psalms, when the people have got nothing to do but look about him, and calls out, with horror and dismay depicted on his countenance, Bless my soul! Everybody says, Somebody taken suddenly ill. Sawyer, late necamorph, sent for. What a business that young man has! At the termination of this disclosure of some of the mysteries of medicine, Mr. Bob Sawyer and his friend Ben Allen threw themselves back into their respective chairs and laughed boisterously. When they had enjoyed the jokes to their heart's content, the discourse changed to topics in which Mr. Winkle was more immediately interested. We think we have hinted elsewhere that Mr. Benjamin Allen had a way of becoming sentimental after brandy. The case is not a peculiar one, as we ourselves can testify, having, on a few occasions, had to deal with patients who have been afflicted in a similar manner. At this precise period of his existence, Mr. Benjamin Allen had perhaps a greater predisposition to maudlinism than he had ever known before, the cause of which malady was briefly this. He had been staying nearly 3 weeks with Mr. Bob Sawyer. Mr. Bob Sawyer was not remarkable for temperance, nor was Mr. Benjamin Allen for the ownership of a very strong head, and the consequence was that, during the whole space of time just mentioned, Mr. Benjamin Allen had been wavering between intoxication partial and intoxication complete. My dear friend, said Mr. Ben Allen, taking advantage of Bob Sawyer's temporary absence behind the counter, whither he had retired to dispense some of the second-hand leeches previously referred to. My dear friend, I am very miserable. Mr. Winkle professed his heartfelt regret to hear it, and begged to know whether he could do anything to alleviate the sorrows of the suffering student. Nothing, my dear boy, nothing, said Ben. You recollect Arabella, Winkle? My sister Arabella, a little girl, Winkle, with black eyes, when we were down at Wardle's? I don't know whether you happen to notice her. A nice little girl, Winkle. Perhaps my features may recall her countenance to your recollection. Mr. Winkle required nothing to recall the charming Arabella to his mind, and it was rather fortunate he did not, for the features of her brother Benjamin would unquestionably have proved but an indifferent refresher to his memory. He answered, with as much calmness as he could assume, that he perfectly remembered the young lady referred to, and sincerely trusted she was in good health. "Our friend Bob is a delightful fellow, Winkle," was the only reply of Mr. Ben Allen. "Very," said Mr. Winkle, not much relishing this close connection of the two names. "I designed 'em for each other. They were made for each other, sent into the world for each other, born for each other, Winkle," said Mr. Ben Allen, setting down his glass with great emphasis. "There's a special destiny in the matter, my dear sir. There's only 5 years difference between 'em, and both their birthdays are in August." Mr. Winkle was too anxious to hear what was to follow, to express much wonderment at this extraordinary circumstance, marvelous as it was. So Mr. Ben Allen, after a tear or two, went on to say that, notwithstanding all his esteem and respect and veneration for his friend, Arabella had unaccountably and undutifully evinced the most determined antipathy to this person. "And I think," said Mr. Ben Allen in conclusion, "I think there's a prior attachment." Have you any idea who the object of it may be?" asked Mr. Winkle, with great trepidation. Mr. Ben Allen seized the poker, flourished it in a warlike manner above his head, inflicted a savage blow on an imaginary skull, and wound up by saying, in a very expressive manner, that he only wished he could guess. That was all. "I'd show him what I thought of him," said Mr. Ben Allen, and round went the poker again, more fiercely than before. All this was, of course, very soothing to the feelings of Mr. Winkle, who remained silent for a few minutes, but at length mustered up resolution to inquire whether Miss Allen was in Kent. "No, no," said Mr. Ben Allen, laying aside the poker and looking very cunning. "I didn't think Wardle's exactly a place for a headstrong girl. So, as I am her natural protector and guardian, all parents being dead, I have brought her down into this part of the country to spend a few months at an old aunt's in a nice, dull, close place. I think that will cure her, my boy, and if it doesn't, I'll take her abroad for a little while and see what that'll do." "Oh, the aunt's in Bristol, is it?" faltered Mr. Winkle. No, not in Bristol," replied Mr. Ben Allen, jerking his thumb over his right shoulder. "Over that way, down there. But hush, here's Bob. Not a word, my dear friend, not a word." Short as this conversation was, it roused in Mr. Winkle the highest degree of excitement and anxiety. The suspected prior attachment rankled in his heart. Could he be the object of it? Could it be for him that the fair Arabella had looked scornfully on the sprightly Bob Sawyer? Or had he a successful rival? He determined to see her, cost what it might. But here an insurmountable objection presented itself, for whether the explanatory "over that way" and "down there" of Mr. Ben Allen meant 3 miles off, or 30, or 300, he could in no wise guess. But he had no opportunity of pondering over his love just then, for Bob Sawyer's return was the immediate precursor of the arrival of a meat pie from the baker's, of which that gentleman insisted on his staying to partake. The cloth was laid by an occasional charwoman, who officiated in the capacity of Mr. Bob Sawyer's housekeeper, and a third knife and fork had been borrowed from the mother of the boy in the grey livery, for Mr. Sawyer's domestic arrangements were as yet conducted on a limited scale. They sat down to dinner, the beer being served up, as Mr. Sawyer remarked, in its native pewter. After dinner, Mr. Bob Sawyer ordered in the largest mortar in the shop, and proceeded to brew a reeking jorm of rum punch therein, stirring up and amalgamating the materials with a pestle in a very creditable and apothecary-like manner. Mr. Sawyer, being a bachelor, had only 1 tumbler in the house, which was assigned to Mr. Winkle as a compliment to the visitor, Mr. Ben Allen being accommodated with a funnel with a cork in the narrow end, and Bob Sawyer contenting himself with one of those wide-lipped crystal vessels, inscribed with a variety of cabalistic characters, in which chemists are wont to measure out their liquid drugs in compounding prescriptions. These preliminaries adjusted, the punch was tasted and pronounced excellent, and it having been arranged that Bob Sawyer and Ben Allen should be considered at liberty to fill twice to Mr. Winkle's once, they started fair with great satisfaction and good fellowship. There was no singing, because Mr. Bob Sawyer said it wouldn't look professional, but to make amends for this deprivation, there was so much talking and laughing that it might have been heard, and very likely was, at the end of the street, which conversation materially lightened the hours, and improved the mind of Mr. Bob Sawyer's boy, who, instead of devoting the evening to his ordinary occupation of writing his name on the counter and rubbing it out again, peeped through the glass door, and thus listened and looked on, at the same time. The mirth of Bob Sawyer was rapidly ripening into the furious. Mr. Ben Allen was fast relapsing into the sentimental, and the punch had well nigh disappeared altogether when the boy, hastily running in, announced that a young woman had just come over to say that Sawyer, late necromorph, was wanted directly, a couple of streets off. This broke up the party. Mr. Bob Sawyer, understanding the message after some 20 repetitions, tied a wet cloth round his head to sober himself, and having partially succeeded, put on his green spectacles and issued forth. Resisting all entreaties to stay till he came back, and finding it quite impossible to engage Mr. Ben Allen in any intelligible conversation on the subject nearest his heart, or indeed on any other, Mr. Winkle took his departure and returned to the bush. The anxiety of his mind, and the numerous meditations which Arabella had awakened, prevented his share of the mortar of punch producing that effect upon him which it would have under other circumstances. So, after taking a glass of soda water and brandy at the bar, he turned into the coffee room, dispirited rather than elevated by the occurrences of the evening. Sitting in front of the fire, with his back towards him, was a tallish gentleman in a greatcoat, the only other occupant of the room. It was rather a cool evening for the season of the year, and the gentleman drew his chair aside to afford the newcomer a sight of the fire. What were Mr. Winkle's feelings when, in doing so, he disclosed to view the face and figure of the vindictive and sanguinary Dowler? Mr. Winkle's first impulse was to give a violent pull at the nearest bell handle, but that unfortunately happened to be immediately behind Mr. Dowler's head. He had made one step towards it before he checked himself. As he did so, Mr. Dowler very hastily drew back. "Mr. Winkle, sir, be calm. Don't strike me. I won't bear it. A blow, never," said Mr. Dowler, looking meeker than Mr. Winkle had expected in a gentleman of his ferocity. "A blow, sir?" stammered Mr. Winkle. "A blow, sir," replied Dowler. "Compose your feelings. Sit down, hear me." "Sir," said Mr. Winkle, trembling from head to foot, "before I consent to sit down beside or opposite you, without the presence of a waiter, I must be secured by some further understanding. You used a threat against me last night, sir. A dreadful threat, sir." Here Mr. Winkle turned very pale indeed, and stopped short. "I did," said Dowler, with a countenance almost as white as Mr. Winkle's. "Circumstances were suspicious. They have been explained. I respect your bravery. Your feeling is upright. Conscious innocence. There's my hand. Grasp it." "Really, sir," said Mr. Winkle, hesitating whether to give his hand or not, and almost fearing that it was demanded, in order that he might be taken at an advantage. "Really, sir, I know what you mean," interposed Dowler. "You feel aggrieved. Very natural. So should I. I was wrong. I beg your pardon. Be friendly. Forgive me." With this, Dowler fairly forced his hand upon Mr. Winkle, and shaking it with the utmost vehemence, declared he was a fellow of extreme spirit, and that he had a higher opinion of him than ever. "Now," said Dowler, "sit down. Relate it all. How did you find me? When did you follow? Be frank. Tell me." "It's quite accidental," replied Mr. Winkle, greatly perplexed by the curious and unexpected nature of the interview. "Quite." "Glad of it," said Dowler. "I woke this morning. I had forgotten my threat. I laughed at the accident. I felt friendly. I said so." "To whom?" said Mr. Winkle. "To Mrs. Dowler. You made a vow," said she. "I did," said I. "It was a rash one," said she. "It was," said I. "I'll apologize. Where is he?" "Who?" inquired Mr. Winkle. "You," replied Dowler. "I went downstairs. You were not to be found. Pickwick looked gloomy, shook his head, hoped no violence would be committed. I saw it all. You felt yourself insulted. You had gone for a friend, perhaps. Possibly for pistols. I spirit, said I. I admire him." Mr. Winkle coughed, and beginning to see how the land lay, assumed a look of importance. "I left a note for you," resumed Dowler. "I said I was sorry. So I was. Pressing business called me here. You were not satisfied. You followed. You required a verbal explanation. You were right. It's all over now. My business is finished. I go back tomorrow. Join me." As Dowler progressed in this explanation, Mr. Winkle's countenance grew more and more dignified. The mysterious nature of the commencement of their conversation was explained. Mr. Dowler had as great an objection to dueling as himself. In short, this blustering and awful personage was one of the most egregious cowards in existence, and interpreting Mr. Winkle's absence through the medium of his own fears, had actually taken the same step as himself, and prudently retired until all excitement of feeling should have subsided. As the real state of the case dawned upon Mr. Winkle's mind, he looked very terrible, and said he was perfectly satisfied, but at the same time said so with an air that left Mr. Dowler no alternative but to infer that if he had not been, something most horrible and destructive must inevitably have occurred. Mr. Dowler appeared to be impressed with a becoming sense of Mr. Winkle's magnanimity and condescension, and the two belligerents parted for the night with many protestations of eternal friendship. About 12:30 o'clock, when Mr. Winkle had been reveling some 20 minutes in the full luxury of his first sleep, he was suddenly awakened by a loud knocking on his chamber door, which, being repeated with increased vehemence, caused him to start up in bed and inquire who was there and what the matter was. "Please, sir, here's a young man which says he must see you directly," responded the voice of the chambermaid. "A young man?" exclaimed Mr. Winkle. "No mistake about that here, sir," replied another voice through the keyhole. "And if that really same interesting young creature ain't let in without delay, it's ready possible as his legs will enter afore his countenance." The young man gave a gentle kick at one of the lower panels of the door after he had given utterance to this hint, as if to add force and point to the remark. "Is that you, Sam?" inquired Mr. Winkle, springing out of bed. "Quite impossible to identify any gentleman with any degree of mental satisfaction without looking at him, sir," replied the voice dogmatically. Mr. Winkle, not much doubting who the young man was, unlocked the door, which he had no sooner done than Mr. Samuel Weller entered with great precipitation, and carefully relocking it on the inside, deliberately put the key in his waistcoat pocket, and, after surveying Mr. Winkle from head to foot, said, "You're a really humorous young gentleman, you here, sir." "What do you mean by this conduct, Sam?" inquired Mr. Winkle indignantly. "Get out, sir, this instant! What do you mean, sir?" "What do I mean?" retorted Sam. "Come, sir, this is rather too rich. As the young lady said, when she remonstrated with the pastry cook, after he'd sold her pork pie as had got nothing but fat inside. What do I mean? Well, that ain't a bad un. "Unlock that door and leave this room immediately, sir," said Mr. Winkle. "I shall leave this room here, sir, just precisely at the very same moment as you leaves it," responded Sam, speaking in a forcible manner, and seating himself with perfect gravity. "If I find it necessary to carry you away, pick-a-back, of course I shall leave it the least bit of time possible afore you. But allow me to express a hope as you won't reduce me to extremities. In saying which, I merely quote what the nobleman said to the fractious Pennywinkle, when he wouldn't come out of his shell by means of a pin, and he consequently began to be afeard that he should be obliged to crack him in the parlour door." At the end of this address, which was unusually lengthy for him, Mr. Weller planted his hands on his knees and looked full in Mr. Winkle's face with an expression of countenance which showed that he had not the remotest intention of being trifled with. "You're a amiably disposed young man, sir, I don't think," resumed Mr. Weller in a tone of moral reproof, "to go and wallowing or press his governor in all sorts of fantiques, when he's made up his mind to go through everything for principle. You're far worse than old Johnson, sir, and as for Fogg, I consider him a born angel to you." Mr. Weller, having accompanied this last sentiment with an emphatic slap on each knee, folded his arms with a look of great disgust, and threw himself back in his chair, as if awaiting the criminal's defense. "My good fellow," said Mr. Winkle, extending his hand, his teeth chattering all the time he spoke, for he had been standing during the whole of Mr. Weller's lecture in his night gear. "My good fellow, I respect your attachment to my excellent friend, and I am very sorry indeed to have added to his causes for disquiet. There, Sam, there." "Well," said Sam, rather sulkily, but giving the proffered hand a respectful shake at the same time. "Well, so you ought to be, and I am very glad to find you here. For if I can help it, I won't have him put upon by nobody, and that's all about it." "Certainly not, Sam," said Mr. Winkle. "There now, go to bed, Sam, and we'll talk further about this in the morning." "I'm really sorry," said Sam, "but I can't go to bed." "Not go to bed?" repeated Mr. Winkle. "No," said Sam, shaking his head. "Can't be done." "You don't mean to say you're going back tonight, Sam?" urged Mr. Winkle, greatly surprised. "Not unless you particularly wish it," replied Sam, "but I mustn't leave this here room. The governor's orders was peremptory." "Nonsense, Sam," said Mr. Winkle. "I must stop here 2 or 3 days, and more than that, Sam, you must stop here too to assist me in gaining an interview with a young lady, Miss Allen, Sam, you remember her, whom I must and will see before I leave Bristol." But in reply to each of these positions, Sam shook his head with great fierceness, and energetically replied, "It can't be done." After a great deal of argument and representation on the part of Mr. Winkle, however, and a full disclosure of what had passed in the interview with Dowler, Sam began to waver, and at length a compromise was effected, of which the following were the main and principal conditions: that Sam should retire, and leave Mr. Winkle in the undisturbed possession of his apartment, on condition that he had permission to lock the door on the outside and carry off the key, provided always that in the event of an alarm of fire or other dangerous contingency, the door should be instantly unlocked. that a letter should be written to Mr. Pickwick early next morning and forwarded per Dowler, requesting his consent to Sam and Mr. Winkle's remaining at Bristol for the purpose and with the object already assigned, and begging an answer by the next coach. If favorable, the aforesaid parties to remain accordingly, and if not, to return to Bath immediately on the receipt thereof. And lastly, that Mr. Winkle should be understood as distinctly pledging himself not to resort to the window, fireplace, or other surreptitious mode of escape in the meanwhile. These stipulations having been concluded, Sam locked the door and departed. He had nearly got downstairs when he stopped and drew the key from his pocket. "I quite forgot about the knocking down," said Sam, half turning back. "The governor distinctly said it was to be done. Amazing stupid of me, that here now." "Never mind," said Sam, brightening up. "It's easily done tomorrow, anyways." Apparently much consoled by this reflection, Mr. Weller once more deposited the key in his pocket, and, descending the remainder of the stairs without any fresh visitations of conscience, was soon in common with the other inmates of the house, buried in profound repose.